Hello, my name's Mike Thelwall from the University of Sheffield, and I'm going to give a quick talk about retractions, Retraction Watch and research methods. So this is from the project that I've been involved with, the EMIF project, and I'm going to talk about the basic idea of retractions and also the Retraction Watch database that we've used and some of the research methods that we've also used in the project. So first of all, I'd like to just clarify what a retraction is if you haven't come across retractions before. So the context of a retraction is that it's a part of academic publishing. It's a rare but important part of academic publishing. And so academic publishing, just to clarify exactly what that is, when academics do research, then they'll usually write it up into a paper and submit this paper summarising their research and their findings and their methods and submit it to an academic journal. And then the next stage is that the journal editor sends the papers to reviewers, experts in the field, to check the research in the paper to see if it's rigorous enough to be published and also if it's novel, so it hasn't been published before, and does it make a useful enough contribution to the journal to publish. So after that process, the editor will look at the reviewer's reports and decide, can the paper be published now, or can it definitely not be published because it can't be made good enough for the journal, or does it need some corrections and then it can be published. So the reviewer comments will be sent through the editor back to the authors of the paper with the decision, and then they'll maybe make a new version to submit to the editor. And this may be repeated a few times, and then eventually the editor either decides to accept the article or reject it. So if the article's accepted, then that means that the editor and the reviewers are satisfied that the research is basically sound and interesting and novel enough to go in the journal. So then it becomes published. It gets typically a position in the journal. So maybe a set of pages in the journal, the print edition or the electronic edition, and a DOI, a digital object identifier, which kind of certifies where it is on the web. And then it becomes part of the scholarly record. And then other academics and end users reading the article can have some confidence that the research that's written up is basically true or has a lot of evidence to support it. So often academic research is more complex than a simple fact that is true or false, but in general a published article has a strong evidence behind it. So the next thing that might happen to an article is that the editor decides, okay, it wasn't good enough to be published after all, because some new information has come to light, and then if that happens, then they might decide to retract the article. And what that means is that they will replace the article on the website with a large notice saying that this article has been retracted, and then it no longer counts as formally published. So the retraction notice might go on top of the journal article or replace it. Normally it goes on top of the journal article, so you can still read the article, but there's a big sign on it saying this has been retracted, so it no longer counts as published. So it no longer counts as having passed quality control because of one or more problems with it. So the problems might be something that the authors themselves discovered, and they realised that they'd made a mistake, or something else had happened which meant that their research wasn't trustworthy anymore, wasn't reliable anymore. So they write to the editor and ask the editor to withdraw it, or someone else might have notified the editor that there was a problem with the article, and then the editor has decided, okay, this is a big enough problem that I need to remove the article. So if it's a small problem, then it might be solved not with a retraction, but with a correction. So the notice appears on the website saying this bit in the article wasn't right, and here's a change in the article. So one of my own journal articles had a correction when it got published with the wrong title. So I had to write to the journal and say, look, you've published it with the wrong title. please can you republish it with the correct title. So that's an example of a correction, but that didn't need a retraction. They didn't need to take the journal article down, just needed to make a small change. So retraction is when you can't do that. It's a more fundamental problem. So the paper needs to be completely withdrawn from the journal. So this is an example of a journal article that's been retracted, and you can see that the title of the article now has retracted at the start. And so if you visit the homepage of the article in its journal, the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents, then you can see very clearly that it's been retracted, because it says that right at the start. So this is a clear statement that it's been retracted. So there's also a retraction notice usually, which is an explanation about why the paper was retracted. So this is on a separate page to the article retraction that we saw before, and it describes the process that led to the retraction. So in some cases the retraction notice just gives a quick sentence and doesn't really tell you anything. But for this particular example, it was a high profile example, and there were a lot of details given about the retraction. So essentially the editor launched an investigation. There were many concerns raised about the article. So the editor summarised the concerns and sent them to the authors of the article, asking them to reply to the concerns by a given deadline, and the editor didn't receive a satisfactory response by the deadline, and therefore decided to retract the article. And this paragraph you can see on the screen summarises which authors of this paper replied, which didn't, which authors agreed, which didn't. So sometimes the authors of a paper will agree with the retraction, and sometimes they don't agree with it, and then that's sometimes mentioned in the retraction notice. So moving on to Retraction Watch. So what is Retraction Watch? Well, it's a website, a blog, a news source that specialises in writing about scientific misconduct, and particularly retractions. So if you visit this website, you'll see every week you will see new stories about scientific misconduct and specific retractions. So at the time when I wrote this presentation, this was the prominent story in the site about the unsafe publications by a famous and very successful psychologist. And there was a concern that, and not all of them, but many of them had problems with them, and the host university was considering retracting them. So in this case, there's an investigation by the university where the academic worked, and this might end up with them writing to journals saying, we no longer trust this research by the academic, so please can you retract it? And then the journal editor will presumably retract the article. So I think it's a high profile website. A lot of people I know are aware of this website and mention it to me. So it's something that's of interest in the academic community, because I guess we consider it important that the record is accurate, the academic record is accurate, and it's interesting to us to hear about examples where things go wrong for one reason or another. So it might be misconduct that leads to the retraction, or it might be sloppy science, or it might be a genuine mistake. And cases where an author spots a mistake, an inadvertent mistake, and then notifies the journal, we think are very good examples of excellent science. So we would praise, I think most people would praise academics that spot a problem and then trigger their own article getting retracted. But on the other hand, you get fraud by some scientists, and then that would obviously be something very bad for the scientists concerned in terms of their reputation. So Retraction Watch covers these issues. I have journalists that write about these stories, and as part of this they compile a list of articles that have been retracted or that have concerns expressed about them. Before an article is retracted, if there's a lengthy process that leads to the retraction, sometimes the editor will place a statement of concern about the article on the journal website, which just flags that the article hasn't been retracted, it's still published, but there are worries about it, so if you are going to use it for research, then you should be very careful about using it. So the Retraction Watch database, what's that? So the Retraction Watch make a database of retracted and otherwise concerning published academic research, which you can find at retractiondatabase.org. And because it's a massive database, tens of thousands of retracted articles and concerning articles, then we can study retraction as a phenomenon. So we can use statistical methods to identify, for example, social media and press interest in retracted articles before they've been retracted, after they've been retracted, if the rate of retraction is increasing over time, and if there continues to be interest in articles after they've been retracted. So the Retraction Watch database is very useful for everyone interested in studying and writing about retractions. So here are some examples of 4 papers that have been written about retractions using the Retraction Watch database. So the first one, do male authors retract more articles than female leading authors? So I'll talk about that in a little bit from this project. And another one, 50 years of retracted medical publications from 1975 to 2024. So this is obviously a study that sees if there's an increase in the rate of retraction in this particular field, and it also looks at the reasons for retraction. Another study looks at retractions in the arts and humanities, which I think are generally less high profile, but they look at the retraction notices to see the reasons for the retraction. And then a final paper, although there are many more, but the final example here is looking at retracted papers from paper mills, which are organisations that produce large numbers of articles fraudulently, for example by artificially making articles and then selling co-authorships of the articles to academics that need them for their CV. So the first example, I'll go through 2 of these papers. The first example, using Retraction Watch data, Urte from our project found that studies with male leading authors were more likely to be retracted, especially for problematic practices. So he classified the reason for retraction in using the Retraction Watch database categories, and also the gender of the author based on their name. So he used a heuristic to work out the likely gender of an author based on their name, and discovered that male authors tended to be more likely to have their work retracted for almost every reason. And the difference was statistically significant for most of the reasons here, except for mistakes. So bad news for male scientists, who seem to be the worst offenders at retraction. So remember, there are good reasons for retraction, but these are mostly bad reasons, such as falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism and duplication. So mistakes can be legitimate, but these other reasons are mainly bad reasons. And in another study, Urte looked at social media attention at retracted articles. So we looked to see how much attention had been on Twitter X for research that was retracted. So he looked at the attention before retraction and after retraction, and found that if articles had a lot of attention on social media, then they were more likely to be retracted than articles that didn't have a lot of attention. And this only applied to a minority of articles. So most articles that get retracted have no attention on social media, but despite that, if they do get attention, they're still more likely to get retracted. So social media helps a little bit to identify articles that are subsequently retracted. Okay, so this was useful to find out the relationship between interest in research and the extent to which it gets retracted. So I think it's kind of common sense really, or it's logical that research that people are more interested in, they're more likely to find flaws in, and then finding these flaws can lead to a retraction. Whereas other papers where people don't have so much interest, maybe they don't read them, maybe not many people read them, then it's less likely that they'll find problems with them or consider the problems important enough to get a retraction. So most of the social media posts about even the retracted articles weren't negative, they just publicised them, so there were just attention to them rather than critiquing them. But there are sites like pubpeer.com which are specially for writing about research where you have concerns about it or you want to comment on it. So it's a kind of post-publication peer review site, pubpeer. So that's where you could go to discuss in more detail problematic research. And here's an example of a social media post criticising an article before it's retracted. So in this post, the author points out that one of the figures in a published paper is not correct. It doesn't have the correct number of bones in the human body, and therefore it's artificially generated rather than a correct image. But these are rare, so it is rare for a problem to be clearly identified. Rare in the sense of a very tiny percentage of published academic research. And this is an example of a discussion on the pubpeer website. So this is an article called "The Safety of COVID-19 Vaccines, We Should Rethink the Policy." And this is an anonymous comment where the commenter has a detailed critique of the article and says that they've used the wrong measures in the article, so the findings are not safe. So this might well lead to a retraction, and this site has these kind of detailed critiques. Okay, so we've looked at the process of retraction and how a published academic journal article can get retracted if problems appear with it, and the retraction is usually completed by the editor of the journal or the publisher. And there's a news site, Retraction Watch, that tracks problems with academic research and retractions in particular and publishes news about them. And in this project we've used the Retraction Watch database to identify large-scale trends in retractions, such as the public interest in retracted research before it's retracted and after it's retracted through social media and gender differences. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found it useful.